All right, welcome everyone. We will go ahead and get started now that we're right at the 15-minute mark. So let me share my slide. All right, welcome to our fourth session in the Embodied Carbon track, for those of you who have been sticking within this track. This session is right-sizing core material building optimization, where we'll be hearing how to optimize structural elements in order to reduce embodied carbon. The learning objectives are shown here, and we'll be following up with a survey with more information on how to receive credit from AIA. We'll also be collecting and submitting all the questions submitted through the Q&A throughout the session. So if we're unable to get to one of the questions during the Q&A portion, we'll be able to have our panelists answer that, and we can post it on the CarbonPositive website after this event. With that, it is my pleasure to introduce the speakers for this session. I'll keep their introductions short, and you can find their full bios on the CarbonPositive website. So we'll start with Don Davies. Don is president of Magnusson, Klemencic Associates, or MKA, a 200-plus person international award-winning structural and civil engineering firm headquartered in Seattle. He is also a leader in embodied carbon lifecycle analyses and a founding member of the Carbon Leadership Forum. Don is joined by Ryan Mullinex, a partner at NBBJ in Seattle, who leads the firm's corporate practice. Ryan has led the design of numerous award-winning national and international projects spanning the corporate, commercial, and higher education markets, and is a frequent speaker and writer on the intersection of performance and beauty. With that, I will hand it over to you, Don.
Thanks, Lindsay. And make sure I get this right.
Yep, that's great.
Okay, good. Here, make one other minor adjustment here. So for everybody here today, NBBJ and MKA, both of our firms started in Seattle, and we have a long history of pushing boundaries. And so this presentation was actually a fun collaboration to put together, because it builds on some of this collective work that we put together. Now, Ed Mazzaria has previously discussed the carpet and the mountains of our urban landscape. And so this presentation is really going to focus on opportunities within what I'll call the mountains, or our cities, which arguably has the potential to be some of our lowest carbon footprint living, with a very important qualifier: if we can get it right. Construction in our cities is without question more carbon intensive as we start to go taller. But minimizing roads and being able to live on a smaller footprint, living close enough to be able to walk to work and play, is critical as our population centers grow. Can we do it better? Absolutely. How do we do it better? I think that's really the goal of this entire day, and certainly part of the focus of this presentation. So we all know we have a problem. I think I'm speaking to the choir when I say that. I think many of us wouldn't even be here in this presentation if we didn't think there was a problem with climate change. But we're at a tipping point. Public awareness is growing, and it's only intensifying with time. Frankly, we can now start to have conversations with our clients on projects that even just a year ago often didn't seem possible. The challenge is, how do we harness that leverage, and how do we build on that momentum in our projects and what we do? I know in some of our practice, for one, the tech industry is especially engaging and pushing us in what I think are some really healthy ways. They want to be seen as part of a solution, not part of the problem. And recent climate pledges by each of these tech leaders is pointing to what I would call a long-needed disruption in our building industry of how we build, what we build with, and how we choose to act. And what I like is it's not just influencing their projects, it's influencing the developers and the contractors and anyone that wants to build for them. And so now we have a heavy lever to act on for our work. And I think one of our challenges is, how do we take advantage of that lever to make momentum? Now, I'm sure these slides are versions of this have been shown already multiple times throughout the day here. But when we talk about our building sector's importance and what we directly control, creating the materials for our buildings and then their ongoing operations account for over half of our carbon emissions today globally. And of that, 22, I think the number here, although I always question the exactness, 22.7% of our global emissions is attributable to embodied carbon. But out of that, when we talk about our realm of action in structural engineering in buildings, 55% of that is the structure and the superstructure and the structure of those buildings. So it's a really good place to focus our energies first. And diving right into one more example of the importance of what we do as the creators of the built environment, a good question for everybody. Have you ever calculated your own personal carbon footprint? I did, and it was kind of shocking to me. I drive an electric car. I have solar panels on my house, but my footprint, at least pre-COVID, was terrible because I was on airplanes so much, flying around the country with our business model where we're based on having just one center of excellence of all the engineers in one place in Seattle. But what does all that have to do with buildings? And a lot of it maybe is a bit of moral self-justification, but after calculating my personal carbon footprint, I went and collected the contractor quantities for each of these 4 towers, and then I calculated the carbon footprint of each of these 4 towers, which are the 4 most recent or currently under construction tallest buildings on the west coast of the US. Now, 2 of these are MKA, 2 are not, but it should be what I would argue is a cross-section of some of the best that our industry has to offer in the dense urban built environment of taller buildings. Now, I've scrambled the order of that last picture because for when I look at the carbon footprint of these 4 projects, because I really didn't want to get into the comparison of who's better or worse. What I really want to talk about is just the difference between these. And note that there is 300 years of my being on an airplane just between the last 2 projects on that graph. Now, for what are functionally equivalent buildings that I was able to numerically show that will have very similar seismic performance, should be able to have similar durability and longevity to the buildings. The point of this to me is we have a long ways to go, and we are not nearly as consistent as we could or should be. So we have to stop offering ourselves as commodity services where it's all just the same. We really need to be careful to not to be complacent, to just be good enough. We need to keep pushing the boundaries to what it is to truly optimize, to truly be the most efficient in our designs. And we need to aggressively work to create a more lower carbon built environment and optimal use of the materials. And that's not just the structural engineer, that's what we do collectively as a group.
Great, so hi everybody. Let me first apologize for not being on screen. I'm having some issues with my Wi-Fi, but nonetheless, Don and I are excited to be here today and talk to you about what we've been up to for the last few decades. NBBJ and MKA have been partnering continuously to explore innovative and environmentally conscious solutions. And today we're excited to talk about some of those outcomes that we've been working on together and with others.
So for the rest of this presentation, we're gonna walk through the decision points and some of the opportunities that exist, I think today, if we're frankly just, if we're paying attention to what we do. And it goes to a little bit the heart of even some of that last slide I was showing of just the difference between our different buildings and the choices that we make. So without question, I think the most critical choice we always make is when we start the building process with our clients. We need to optimize the performa, make the decision, should we be building at all, or is there a renovation of an existing space that can come in? But when we are creating that dense urban environment, are we building around mass transit? Are we encouraging lower carbon living? Are we creating an environment where people want to live, work, and play, and get out of their cars, and even live without a car? Now, optimize what we can control on a project-by-project basis, because some of those obviously are planning levels that are before it gets to a level of just talking about the specific buildings. But on the buildings, are we optimizing net to gross ratios? The building shape and the program efficiency are critical to the buildings. But another topic I want to bring up is right sizing for durability. Now, I always like to go back to nature and show some different natural examples as we build forward, but taking a cue from nature, I like that if you think about it this way, she's very deliberate about when to build for permanence And in fact, where to be more delicate with highly recyclable systems. And I'll be the first to say, I think our buildings can and should do more of the same. When we build a tower in its life and what we do at the ground plane, they should be different conversations.
So this decision about what is permanent and what is changeable is quite crucial. And in fact, in the United States, the average lifespan of a commercial building is around 70 years, which is shorter than the lifespan of a human. So one of the things that we've been looking at is how do we build the things that last forever and also build the things that are intentionally temporary or adaptable, changeable. This project here is one that was a joint venture with MKA to look at a high rise in downtown Seattle. And similar to the forest that Don just showed you, we thought about the urban environment where the tall building should stand for hundreds of years, if not forever. But the ground plane, which is constantly changing, is it retail? Is it social? Is it community? What type of programs will be there 10 years from now? Those parts, those elements should be constantly able to change and adaptable for fear of being outdated. So you can see here what we did was create a mega frame that allows for that adaptation at grade. The buildings, the smaller scale buildings, 1, 2, and 3 stories at the base of the building could be changed out in the future. But that framework, that strong structure in the middle is permanent. It's intended to last for over 1,000 years. You can see here we're standing beneath it. It soars above you. It opens up through the inside. Wonderful in terms of natural ventilation and daylight, but also really a truth in terms of the structural components that were used. It shows what the building's intending to do, whether it's above you or at the ground floor with you. If you go to the next slide, you'll see how we thought about daylight and visibility and ventilation and adaptability. All of those factor into this, 1,000-year building up above of the ground plane. We think about how an office can change or and will change over time, how an office can even become a hotel or any other type of use that happens there. But we want to ensure that first and foremost, what people need in their day-to-day is provided in that 1,000-year structure above ground. But at ground, what people need in the here and now is there as well. So if you go to the next slide, you'll get a sense of how that begins to feel in the interior of that space. You can imagine this is a place to work. This is a place to play. This is a place for a community. This is a place for a hotel. It has a lot of future potential to it. And if you go to the next slide, you'll get a sense of how Don's been able to incorporate that elsewhere in Seattle.
Yeah, and just building on what Ryan was saying there, especially like that retail at the base, if we know that the building is only going to have a 25 or so year life because of program oscillations, let's make sure we're building with materials that are a right fit for that durability. And in fact, that's exactly the place, more modular construction, building for disassembly. So where you can disassemble the parts and then go rebuild it somewhere else. This interpretive center that was used after about a 20-year life for a developer to showcase development of a certain area was disassembled and reassembled as a school building at a different location. Creating more examples and being more intentional of where we are modular and building for disassembly, I think is something in our future we got to spend more time with. So prior to starting a project, when do you know what design can you rely on to know if we are already optimized for longevity? And this goes a little bit to what I was just talking about earlier. Without question, to me, looking at biomimicry, biophilic design, nature is, again, very intentional about her choices of what we do, and often is the optimized carbon solution. We need to take more cues here and pay more attention. So optimizing systems, knowing that you can't manage what you don't measure, starting with that, only building what we actually need. Ryan, I'll turn this over to you.
Yeah, so one of the areas we've really focused on recently with clients, and clients can be a developer, a client can be an end user, it can be the city. We've really been diving into understanding how to measure, ask the right problems, and discern which parts, which designs have the most value. So as you can imagine, multiple variables are always at play, and it usually means we need to make sacrifices. But if we can assess what's most valuable to a client and also to the environment, we can usually land on the right outcome for everyone. If you go to the next slide, you'll see a video of what we did for Samsung headquarters in San Jose. And in this particular instance,
Ryan, I think we're
trying to study the structural system as it related to visibility
I'm gonna move
across
on to
the
the next.
floor. You're seeing across the floor. I think I'm.
Ryan, I lost part of your connection there, so I hope did that open up some bandwidth for you?
I'm back. Can you hear me?
There you're back. Yeah, now I can hear you. Yep, you're back.
Great. Well, I'm glad you clicked ahead. All I was going to note is that constantly studying and understanding how to put the right spaces in the right place helps us build the right buildings. And those don't have to be just qualitative or quantitative measurements. We can also look at the qualitative side, establishing a series of goals and drivers and beginning to unpack what does it mean from a cultural perspective? What does it mean from an environmental perspective? If we get those measurements correct, and we measure it in a way that we can make the right decisions, the outcome for the environment, the outcome for embodied carbon is almost always spot on. And this is a project that we just moved in. We got our master use permit. We're heading into demo. We're doing with MKA as well. This is for another high rise in Seattle. In this instance, we've offset an entire core in a 36-story building. And the idea here was to get at that emphasizing of health. And we started with environmental health. Let's fine tune the building to make it exactly what it needs to be and nothing more. So back to that optimization, we have a number of variables. How can we begin to optimize for the situation here? In moving the core though, you can imagine the ripple effect. It has a wonderful open floor plate, so wonderful in terms of organizational and individual health. The top 3 floors are completely open. There's no core in the way, so it becomes a landscape park on the top of the building with wonderful views to Seattle and beyond. We're able to move things like stairs to the ends of the building to encourage physical health. The ground plane is completely open versus having a center core in that building, which means then that we can change and adapt that program however it needs to go. But probably most importantly, back to that environmental health, not only did we optimize the structural system for it, we also had to build 25% less below grade systems for parking and stability because we chose the right system.
So part of that, even building on that example a little bit, optimizing. I always like to go back again to nature to look at optimized systems. And this here, we're looking at the cross section of a bird wing. And the lesson in this, to me, it's interesting that bird bone material is actually quite a bit denser than human bone. But the reality is, the highly evolved bird bone structure is the strongest material it can create only at the locations that it needs it, and it optimizes it for performance. So the outside of the bone, that tube structure on the outside, working as a space frame or as a shell for taking flexural load. And then internally, it takes material out where it doesn't need to be. So even though the material is more dense, is a stronger material than human bone, it's actually orders of magnitude lighter. We need to take that same kind of an idea into our building designs. And in fact, what I love is there's actually some lessons that we need to relearn into an era where material optimization was actually the economic decision more than labor optimization. And so this is actually going back to a 1962 project by Skilling, who's now our predecessor that is now evolved into becoming MKA and NBBJ. Very clean load path, high repetition. Think about this for a minute. There was only 12 drawings that described the structure for this entire office building. but every piece was very thoughtfully placed and highly optimized. It's a side core building. It has a 60-foot clear span, but there's a column right at the end of every beam with a very direct load path directly down to the foundations. Now, this was done out of necessity. There was no calculators around for the design. When this building was done, it was all done with a slide rule. And so everything had to be very intentional. This also, though, was one of the very first projects ever built with the use of a castellated beam. Not only a castellated beam, an asymmetrical beam, where the top flanges were smaller than the bottom flanges and were composite with a concrete slab on the top. Versions of this exist today. This is the proprietary Angelina beam from ArcelorMittal. But just not only just with castellated beams, but just the choice of going to an asymmetrical built-up is a 20 to 35% reduction in the amount of steel needed to carry the same load if we make a composite construction and use that shape. The reason we don't do that today is the labor cost to create these asymmetrical built-ups, which tend to be built out of plate. Now, AISC is currently looking at bringing these online again into the US market as a product, but know that there's this kind of opportunity. And what I would challenge the designers here is you need to explore these boundaries before you make final choices. One last element, though, to be very mindful of is where the material come from also really matters in your steel. Asymmetrical built-ups, even though it'd be, say, 35% less steel, if it is first generation steel, say from China or the US, beam will have a lower carbon footprint. So you got to pay attention to both the optimal use of the material and where it comes from. But taking this to another example and a fun project here that we even started that first image from, a soccer ball was the inspiration behind the Amazon Spheres, which is another MKA and NBBJ collaboration. The key is it's a 5-sided repeating Catalan shape that creates the 2-directional curve for the panels of this building. And when we started this, many forms were explored for what this Catalan could be, a highly optimized effort between MKA and NBBJ to study all sorts of different alternatives. And it really came down to what was the biggest tube bending machine on the west coast of the US? What was it capable of bending? And then how could we create an optimal repeating pattern out of that shape? And so out of this, we came up with the final Catalan shape, which actually was about a 30% reduction in the total amount of material than the starting point that we did for the steel shape that was going to form these Catalans. And here you're looking at a parametric routine we also worked together on to help optimize the glass panels that were going to be used to cover the Catalan steel on the outside to minimize the amount of waste that went into the design process. And through this, we ended up coming up with optimal shapes of steel, glass, and getting to a very exacting pattern. So not just for the Catalan itself, but the other materials that went into this. Now, actually, there was a very limited number of drawings used to describe these Catalans because of their curving bidirectional, but almost like a flower petal shape. Once the pattern was set, it repeated itself again and again as always kind of an identical form. So when it came to fabrication of the pieces, and here you can see one of these being fabricated at Columbia Wire and Iron, it was a very repeating pattern where the manufacturing process could get optimized because the same piece repeated itself again and again in the final form. So when you look at the final product of these spheres, it's an elegant and inspiring shape that was created, but at its core, it was actually a highly optimized, highly repeated pattern, in some ways harkening all the way back to that related piece. So I'm going to switch topics here for a moment, and here's kind of a question: which is the lowest carbon footprint when we choose our buildings for concrete? And I've looked at this and studied it several different ways, and I'm going to show some work here that's not by MKA or NBBJ, but only because I think they have better data in looking at the same study. But in this recent study for a 7-story office building where we looked at full designs of concrete, steel, structural steel, or mass timber, and similar to this study that had been done by Miller Hull, it really comes up to it's a question of depends. It depends on where the material is sourced, and did we not only carbon optimize the design, did we carbon optimize where the material came from? Now, this one has shown a difference between the three, but frankly, for the uncertainties in the data, to me, this is a statistical heat. You can't tell the difference between those 3 buildings if the timber was sourced unsustainably. Now, without a doubt, the best case scenario, sustainably harvested woods, is hands down the best alternative. But folks, that very far picture on the very right, FSC certified timber with a Dow laminated timber floor system coming from the Pacific Northwest, that's much less than 10% of available lumber that we have out there. So I really want to caution us that while a lot of us are out there selling the very far right of this, this image, that isn't necessarily the product that is being delivered to our projects. And we need to dig deeper. We need to push farther into accountability of what we're doing to be able to tell this story. The upstream impacts where our materials come from, it matters. Just using wood isn't good enough. It really needs to go to that next step if we in fact are saying we want to do it right. And what do I mean in that very first picture? What's the difference between the most sustainable sourced wood to the worst condition? So here's a picture just south of where my hometown is in Seattle of what I mean by unsustainably harvested timber. This is harvesting of forest inventory that's being converted into strip malls, housing, and you know, the Home Depot's going in after the timber's been harvested there. We need to keep the timber in timber stock, whether that's reforest and plantation in timber boundaries. Deforestation is one of the worst conditions that we really have to pay attention to. And I know there's a lot of people in the presentation here from South America, so I really want to help emphasize that point. It's not just a South American issue, but it really does matter. If we really are going to look at wood as being part of our solution, we have to ask the questions and pay attention on where it comes from. It offers hope, but we have to make sure we get it right. So, embodied carbon procurement, I think there's probably some others talking about EC3, which has been a fascinating journey for its creation, but it really comes down to some pretty simple math. You need to start by tracking your structural embodied carbon of your building by knowing your material footprint. We need to know our quantities. And we need, once we know our quantities, we need to manage to a budget. But once you know your quantities, we can ask for environmental product declarations with that inventory control to tell a story where the material is coming from. And it's simply the two of those multiplying together to come up with carbon footprint of our building. We can use industry average information during design, and then at that point of procurement, we can get into the specifics from the suppliers, which is really a differentiating point. And one other example of this, okay, this is concrete, a recent project of ours in Los Angeles where we asked for the EPDs. This is a Brookfield project. What we ended up stumbling onto was the issue of quality control at the batch plant and paying attention to the aggregate supply. And what we found is by using an imported aggregate and working with a concrete supplier, National Concrete, on this one, we were able to reduce the overall carbon footprint of this building by 24% just by changing the aggregate supply going into the concrete mixes for the project. In fact, for the post-tension slab mixes alone, we were able to reduce the carbon footprint by 47%. And that what this really came down to was quality control at the batch plant. So we were getting the same strength concrete. We didn't even have to necessarily reduce the longer set times. It was just quality control, taking cement out in replacing it with a better quality rock because it was more consistent and more predictable on how the material was going to behave. We have to ask hard questions, and sometimes the results are going to be surprising. Hard questions, but also working with our suppliers on what's possible in what they do.
So as we think about the right decisions and the right measurements to take, we also want to be thinking, and what Don and I wanted to share with you was, how do we optimize details? How do we take into consideration a larger systems approach by the parts that make it up? So one of the things we've been looking at recently is just the notion of how are green buildings performing. And it was surprising what we found. We've been working with the University of Washington to study how embodied carbon, how we can reduce it at every phase, and how in a green building, what's the occupancy comfort like? How are things working for those who are in these types of buildings? And what we found is that two things stood out. One is thermal comfort was poor in a LEED rated green building. That's the system we use here in the United States. And acoustics were poor as well. And so we began to unpack this because our concern was we would start adding more material to the building after it was built to take care of these two things, to take care of thermal comfort and acoustics. So one of the things we came up with was, if you go to the next slide, this idea of using embedded resonators within slabs, within cross-laminated timber, mass timber. These are called Helmholtz resonators. They're like a wine bottle. And you know, if you blow over the top of a wine bottle, there's a noise that's made. This does actually quite the opposite. That neck of a wine bottle actually grabs the acoustics out of the air and holds on to it and dissipates the energy. And so we've been studying how to do this in a way that can be cast into a system that's already in place. We don't have to come in with materials later, especially in this day and age of COVID-19 with porous materials that can introduce new types of pathogens or places for pathogens to hide in our buildings. If you go to the next slide. The other thing we've been exploring is a phase change material. And Don, you might jump ahead just because this is a video and we had issues last time with the video. Phase change materials are kind of wonderful opportunities to think about the needs you have during the course of the day. We've been working with Carnegie Mellon as well as with Cal Poly to look at phase change materials, which are like a lard. And what they do is they crystallize when the temperature gets cold outside, and they become a highly insulative type of material. But then they dissipate and turn into a clear substance when it's warm outside, and they release that heat. And what's really intriguing to us is if we put this into our walls, it has a thermal property that's right at the right time. It gets holds in the warmth when we want it to, and it releases it when we don't want it to. But we can also begin to think about using it in our interior environments. So we're not adding more stuff into our buildings, but rather just letting the building do what it needs to do, to let it become highly visible when it's warm, when people are active, when they're around each other, and to let it become much more translucent or opaque when we want to kind of create some sort of a screen or a shelter when there are fewer people around. All of this tempers the mechanical systems and the air needed within your space.
So when we start talking about phase change, one of the fun places I like to look at is, okay, here we're looking at a glacier. But as a structural engineer, when I look at this, what I see is one hell of a tall shoring wall. But there's no concrete, there's no rebar, there's no soldier piles involved. This is all just natural materials within our built environment. And in fact, you can do this. Here we're looking at soil freezing as a way to do an excavation of a site. And you're trading off a pure energy cost for concrete, steel, rebar, other materials that you'd use to otherwise be able to drill this excavation or dig this excavation. The technology is quite old school. It goes back to Germans and other Nordic countries that they found digging their basements for their buildings and their castles in the middle of the winter. In fact, was one of the best ways to get that basement built in a more stable condition. And we even I proposed this on a project in Miami where we were looking at how do we control water coming up through a hole at the bottom of the site. And we ended up building a 30 by 30 test condition and proving it out. And this was a study I had looked at of the alternatives. We did traditional approaches that were used in Miami for a tremie slab and the concrete and steel for that mat versus the soil freezing, and in fact showed that it was a lower carbon footprint to do the soil freezing than it was to put those other materials in for that temporary purpose that were left in permanently. Now, we didn't actually build the project using soil freezing in Miami, because after we proved that it was possible and the technology was there, the price point for a grout injection process for that particular project in Miami, the price dropped by several $1 million to basically keep the soil freeze out, and the owner looked at it as lower risk to do it with grout injection instead of a soil freeze. But it's a technology that is totally out there, and if we want to start paying attention to carbon footprints of our below grade, it's something that can be explored in the right conditions. A few other fun ideas to think about on where we can optimize. You know, when's the last time you ever saw a square tree? The circular shape, especially for carrying a compressive load, is an optimal shape for us as an engineer. So going from a square to a circular column, actually eliminating all those cross ties, going to just a spiral tie, gives us a higher capacity element where we can carry more load with less material. And in fact, if you take that spiral column all the way to, say, a concrete filled pipe, we can start using the concrete inside of that pipe with maybe a longer strength gain, because you're not worried about the set time to strip the formwork, which often will control the design process, sometimes even more than what we need for final strength on a column, to go to even more carbon optimally sized elements. Now, a circle isn't always the easiest shape to work with architecturally, but if I'm purely on what's the lowest carbon footprint column we can do, for compressive axial loads, if you ask your engineer, circles are always going to be the better way to go. One more idea here to consider. Recently, when I was looking at nature's version of a tall tower and trees, I stumbled across this image from the Forest Service, which is used to calculate the harvestable volume of a pine tree. And when I saw it, it actually kind of stopped me in my tracks, because when we think about high-rise seismic design, we spent years trying to figure out and optimize where's the best place to put the material in our high-rise buildings to be most optimal. And so in a tower like this, if we paid attention, we probably could have saved years of hard-fought battles if we just went backwards and looked at things like this graph from the Forest Service, because in fact, here's the overturning moment on our tall, slender cantilever towers like this. And look at that, it magically follows the same graphic and form of where nature already knew where to put the material for an optimal form. Many times the answer is there if we just look for it in the right places. So in fact, here's our 150 North Riverside project in Chicago, where I wish I could say we started with the biophilic form and moved it forward, but in fact, when nature agrees with what we did, at least we know we were doing something right.
So Don and I thought we would stop on this slide and just kind of pause, say, it's interesting in this time when we're feeling the toll on our environment, on our health, on our families and our economies. It's tempting to try to solve these issues independently. And in reality, unfortunately, the impacts are incredibly intertwined. Designing a building that's healthy for the planet almost always, if not always, results in a building that's healthy for people, such as the Amazon spheres. And so as tough as today might be, there's much to be optimistic about. Don and I are optimistic about what the built environment's going to be like in the very near future. So we thought we'd now open it up to Q&A.
Lindsay, do I stop share or do I stay here as that next step?
Yep. Go ahead and stop sharing.
Okay.
Okay, great. And we have Brian via audio, which is fine. So we only have a couple minutes. I think we only have time to take maybe one question here. So for those of you that we don't get to, we'll post your questions on the CarbonPositive website. I'm going to modify a question from Brian. So Brian wants to know, how do you balance the embodied carbon cost of building for longevity versus the urgent need to reduce embodied carbon and meeting our 2020, 2030, 2040 targets?
I'll strike a shot, Don, and then I'd love for you to pile on. I think it's a great question. Actually, when I read through the question, a lot about this whole idea of 1,000-year building. And I would say that's actually the debate that's had. It's, do we want to build for long-term and really invest in that and understand the return on that investment, meaning the embodied carbon investment, but also how we create a place that for 1,000 years can withstand an earthquake, as someone said, become that arc, can be changed from program every 100 years as it needs to. I think that contrasted against, should we start building things that don't have much of a footprint and let them change over constantly? I think that's the thing we're caught in between. And that's where my head goes, is we need to be thinking about beyond 2050 and understand that return, or we need to be thinking just for 2025 and understand that return there as well.
I think it's a really, really good question that we need to wrestle with and struggle with as an industry, because there's not a one single answer to it. And the biggest thing for me is we need to be much more intentional with our choices. One of the worst things, and it's one of that earlier slides where we're showing kind of the trees and then the floor, the fern floor. One of the worst things is when we use buildings or materials that are going to last hundreds of years, and we tear them down after 15, 20 years, throw them away, and then go build a new building. We need to be much more intentional with our choices and right-size what we're doing. Frankly, I think it starts with land use planning. But we need to decide where we're going to make the infrastructure investments to build the buildings that are going to last 1,000 years. And then we need to decide, if it's only going to be a very short-term duration, build intentionally for what we do. So whether that's modular or other temporary works, I don't have one single answer for it, but other than just to be very thoughtful and intentional in what we're doing and kind of get rid of the middle ground.
Yeah, absolutely. That was the image that came to my mind too when you said that was your trees versus the forest floor, and designing for longevity versus for turnover. So with that, we only have 3 minutes left before our next session. So I am going to go ahead and conclude this session, and I want to give a thank you to Don and Ryan for a really incredible presentation and a thoughtful reply to a question. And with that, I will hopefully see you all on future sessions. The one following this within the embodied carbon track, we'll be talking more about bio-based materials as well as carbon capture within our high impact materials. And with that, thank you.
Thanks all.